I think it's probably fairly safe to say that some of the media coverage of the proposed Stage 3 tax cuts has been absolutely bonkers. Before we get into it, just remember here that what Labor have proposed will deliver a tax cut for all taxpayers and will deliver a bigger tax cut for 85% or more of the population than what they would have received under the Coalition's version of Stage 3. Let's start with this exchange in an interview with the Prime Minister on Sky News.
A lobster, that's basically what you get, even less, $16.40 for those low to middle income earners per week. Is that lobster enough in the supermarket to allow people to forgive you for breaking an election promise? Is that lobster enough for you to win the next election when you're taking $4,500 a year off people who
can afford it? Sorry, Andrew, I'll let you finish.
Were expecting $9,000 who voted for you.
I'll tell you what, Andrew, the fact is that politicians and perhaps yourself are not going to get as much as you were going to get. But I tell you what, for average income earners out there on $73,000 a year, they're going to get double the tax cut.
For starters, there's a false equivalence going on here. Comparing weekly versus annual tax cuts is just silly. Putting aside the performative waving of the $20 note, this whole line of questioning is silly and why massive slabs of the population hold journalists in such low regard.
Right. Let's do the math.
Under the proposed Stage 3, someone receiving a tax cut of $20 a week, or a lobster, is earning approximately $50,000 a year. So that $20 a week is a tax cut of $1,040 per year. That $1,040 represents 2% of that person's taxable income. Now, if someone was expecting a $9,000 tax cut under the Coalition's version of Stage 3, they'd need to be earning $200,000 a year or more. If someone is earning $200,000 per year and now only gets a tax cut of $4,500, would you like to take a stab at what that $4,500 represents as a percentage of their taxable income? That's right, just a nudge over 2%. Is the argument really that a person on $50,000 per year should get less just so someone on $200,000 can get twice as much? So what Andrew is really asking here is, do you think that breaking an election promise that will see 85% of the population receiving a larger tax cut than they expected, will that be enough to offset the anger and disappointment from a certain portion of the 15% that will still get a tax cut, mind you, just not quite as large as what they may have expected? So a lobster a week might not sound like much to Andrew Clennell, but for someone on $50,000 a year, well, it's enough to pull together a dodgy Pickles spag bowl, that's for sure. And Andrew, do you know how much that person on $50,000 a year would get under the Coalition's version of Stage 3? Less than $2.50 per week. I'm no magician in the kitchen, but I'm not sure I could do my spag bowl for less than $2.50. Cut to wall-to-wall coverage of the Coalition talking heads, talking rather angrily.
It's hard to imagine the Coalition would seek to overturn more generous tax cuts for low and middle income earners.
Well, thanks, Kieran, and great to be with you. Well, in the first instance, what does the Coalition believe in? We believe in lower taxes.
One can only assume that she's quite happy that 85% of taxpayers stand to pay less tax under Labor's proposal, right?
This is what is offending Australians, Kieran. We now have, without a doubt, a liar in the lodge.
Well, there's a slogan I reckon we'll hear a fair bit of. Sounds like it was well workshopped too.
So what do we support?
Sure, yeah.
We support tax cuts. We anticipate over 500,000 Western Australians will now pay more under Labor's tax package.
Okay, even if you want to take her at her word and 500,000 Western Australians won't receive the tax cut they had previously expected, it's really not that far off the national average. Population of WA is about 2.6 million people, so 500,000 represents around 18 to 19%. This means that over 80% of the WA population are going to be better off under the proposed plan.
I have had people in the last few days tell me, Kieran, they had long ago made decisions based on the fact that on the 1st of July 2024, Stage 3 would come into effect. Imagine how those people today are feeling, knowing that Mr Albanese lied to them.
Yeah, imagine that.
But more than that, when you look at the actual package, We've estimated that what's going to be returned to Australians who actually do end up with something is around $15 a week.
Rob the poor to feed the rich.
At the end of the day, what these people seem to be arguing for is a larger tax cut for the top 10 to 15% of earners at the expense of the remaining 85 to 90% of the population. Good luck with that argument.
A liar in the lodge.
This is where I have a real hard time taking anything the Coalition say on this issue seriously. I mean, glass houses and stones and stuff like that. Did Michaela have a problem when Tony Abbott was in the lodge?
No cuts to education, no cuts to health, no change to pensions, no change to the GST, and no cuts to the ABC or SBS.
Tony essentially went on to break a majority of those. Don't worry, we'll get to that in a bit.
But two wrongs never made anything right.
Speaking of tones, I caught the first episode of Nemesis on the ABC the other night. One quote stood out to me and kind of sent shivers down my spine.
I've never known a person in a leadership position as dominated by another as Tony Abbott was by Peter Credlin.
Unrelated.
You've been a very naughty boy.
Did Michaela have a problem when Scotty was cooking his curries in the lodge?
A curry for the country. Hey, I'm going to tell the Prime Minister that one. A curry for the country. I love it. I love Indian food. It's my favourite food.
Please, sir, I want some more.
I don't support the government's change and broken promises on tax cuts. I think it's very important to note that it's not really a tax cut what was announced last week.
Now that ain't true now.
I'm not enthusiastic to vote for higher taxes. I want to lower taxes, and that's what the Coalition's plan originally did.
If you had any doubt about which party the bulk of the Australian media are behind, this really should help. Let's jump back to the Tony Abbott broken promises extravaganza of 2014. You may or may not remember the 2014 budget. That was the budget in which Tony Abbott broke almost every election promise under the sun. That budget was nightmare fuel, unless you were the mining industry, the private sector, defence, or a high income earner. If you didn't fall into one of those categories, you fell squarely into the loser column. Well, News Corps took a very different view to broken promises back then. Here are some newspaper front pages the day after the budget dropped, courtesy of Greg Jericho on Twitter. Despite the heavy sales pitch, Australians were generally smart enough to know a turd when they smelt one. Anyway, contrast that coverage, in which most of the population was worse off, with the coverage of Albo's broken promise, also known as the backflip that will deliver a larger tax cut to 85% of taxpayers. Notice any difference? It's weird, isn't it? It's rubbish like this that prevents grown-up political conversations in this country.
$20 being given to you under these proposed tax changes.
A lobster.
At least Sky and the opposition are on the same page when it comes to their communication strategy. As much as the opposition and their friends in the media are having problems dealing with, or not dealing with, the proposed changes, it seems there are a lot of diehard Labor fans having a rough time coming to terms with the fact that their party's broken an election promise as well.
I'm sorry, can we just hit pause for a second, please?
My word is my bond. And we said during the election campaign that we would maintain the position that had already been legislated.
That's a really interesting point, though. I mean, I understand that, and it goes to the integrity of the individual, and people want to believe their leaders. But you don't believe in this, surely. You don't believe that at this time, with all the pressures in the economy, people doing it tough out there, people living below the poverty line, that giving tax cuts to the ultra-rich is a priority.
What I believe in is certainty for people. And we said we would provide that certainty, and we will. I've always been a man of my word, and I believe that when you go to an election and you make commitments, you should stick to them.
For the people trying to dispute or deny that Labor ever committed to the delivery of the legislated Stage 3 tax cuts ahead of the 2022 election, I'm really not sure it's up for debate at this point, but just in case, here's a copy of the media release issued in 2021, clearly outlining the government's position heading into the 2022 federal election. An Albanese Labor government will deliver the same legislated tax relief to more than 9 million Australians as the Morrison government. Will deliver the same legislated tax relief. The same. The shadow cabinet and caucus have today confirmed that Labor in government will uphold the legislated changes to personal income taxes and maintain the existing regimes for negative gearing and capital gains tax. Look, I honestly don't think it gets any clearer than that. Trying to argue that Labor hasn't broken an election promise here is the Ozpol equivalent of trying to argue that the Earth's flat. Look, you can argue that this was a promise broken for a good reason. You could argue that it was perhaps a promise that should not have been made in the first place. Or you could argue that this was a promise both made and then broken for political reasons. You can argue a lot of things, but what you can't argue though is that Labor never promised to deliver the legislated Stage 3 tax cuts. Arguing that is an attempt at rewriting reality, which in turn makes you no different or better than these guys. I don't know what else to say, that's just how it is. Now, thanks to Labor's commitment, their election promise, and now their 180, we're just going to have the unfortunate privilege of having to listen to the opposition and their friends in the media constantly remind everyone that Labor lied. We won't be able to have a grown-up conversation about anything.
The Prime Minister has knowingly and willingly lied to the Australian people.
How can we trust you, PM? Remember when you said, "My word is my bond"?
If you want to see more about what I thought of the proposed Stage 3 tax cuts, check out the older video here. Otherwise, see ya.